So we should know by now that a high current account deficit is detrimental to the achievement of external stability as per the government economic goal. So what we're going to look at in this lecture is the causes of a high current account deficit. And we're going to focus on primarily the demand side factors causing a high current account deficit. Okay, so as we know, the current account can be broken into two major categories and a third minor one. So the current account, which you're going to denote CA, can be broken up into the balance of goods and services, as well as primary incomes. And if you want to remind yourselves of what these two different subcategories of the current account are, you can look at the lecture on current accounts. And there's also secondary incomes, which are just transfers, but this sector or this category, subcategory, reflect a very small proportion of our current account, and therefore we're just going to neglect this for the simplicity of our analysis. So we're not going to worry about secondary incomes for this lecture. So we're just going to look at balance of goods and services and our primary income. Now, as we know, the balance on goods and services is exports and imports, whereas primary incomes relate to interest, dividends, and other sources of major income flowing in and out of the country. So what we're going to focus on is this demand factors that may lead to a high current account deficit. So we know that the current account consists of the balance of goods and services. And we know that aggregate demand is also a component, C plus I plus G plus net X. We also know that exports and imports are also a component of aggregate demand. So as we can see, when imports are greater than exports, a current account deficit should rise. And we know this because imports are recorded as a debit, so money flowing out of the economy, or purchasing power flowing out of the economy, and exports recorded as a credit, which means purchasing power or money flowing into the economy. So as we can see, when imports increase, then the current account deficit would increase. So what causes imports to increase? Well, firstly, we should know that imports consist of consumable goods or final goods, or it can be producer inputs. So a lot of producers would import materials from overseas because it's cheaper to produce overseas, and to cut costs and to maximize profits, it becomes more viable for these producers to purchase their inputs from overseas. So take, for example, a car manufacturer in Australia, or a car dealer. They would not produce cars on site in Australia because of extensive high labor costs. They would in fact hire an overseas producer, say China or Malaysia, to produce cars to import to Australia and sell as a final good or service. So producer inputs, as we know, 80% of inputs, or around that, are imports. So what does this mean how does this relate back to the current account deficit? So what demand factors cause the current account deficit? Or to be more precise, what demand factors actually cause imports to increase? So now we've talked about how consumable final goods are a component of imports. We can talk about what causes people to consume more imports. So firstly, we're going to put this in a green star, which we're just going to right here in the bottom left corner. So what causes consumers to consume more final goods or services that are imports? So firstly, their incomes rise. When your incomes rise, you tend to purchase more overseas, and that's where our imports increase. So incomes rise, and by the same token, when our income rises, consumer confidence should rise. So when consumer confidence rises, it is very likely that we will start importing more. Also, we can talk about population size, so population growth. And even cheaper products, so cheaper substitutables, cheaper products overseas. So these are our stock standard demand side factors that cause an increase in the demand of certain products. Now let's look at why producers produce more. And these are stock standard supply side factors, but from a demand perspective from producers. So business confidence, if they expect to sell more, then they're going to purchase more inputs. So business confidence is another major demand side factor for imports. Business confidence, wage levels go down, and they have more incentive to purchase more inputs and to purchase more capital equipment from overseas so as to increase their efficiency. And we know all these different types of producer demand factors from previous lectures, and I won't go through all of them, but these are just two of the main demand side factors by producers to import more. So now, as we can see, the major factor that increases imports here is high levels of domestic confidence. So when aggregate demand or a level of confidence in the economy rises, we tend to import more and we tend to consume more as well. And because consumption is around 80% of aggregate demand, even though we're importing more, this won't affect aggregate demand as much as consumption domestically would. So some people may argue, even though if imports increase, that means net exports would decrease, and that means aggregate demand would decrease. But how would that be the case when our incomes rise, consumer confidence is high, there's population growth? Shouldn't aggregate demand by theory increase? Well, yes, it would increase because net exports only contributes a small proportion of aggregate demand. The large increase is in consumption right here, and therefore aggregate demand, the decrease in aggregate demand from an increase in the balance on net exports, or a decrease in the balance on net exports, I should say, is actually overshadowed by a greater increase in consumption spending domestically. So now we can see that the cause of the high current account deficit is measured by our imports over exports, and the demand for imports come from consumers as well as producers, which are affected by our confidence, population level, our incomes, business profitability, and the ability to substitute products overseas. So that's what causes our high current account deficit at the moment, purely looking at the demand side factors that may affect the current account deficit.